if anyone doesn't want to get recorded, don't ask questions until afterwards, then we'll turn the sound off, turn the video off. Just as a bit of background, I started working with disasters when I was a psychologist at the Children's Hospital in 1983, and Ash Wednesday occurred. And I was part of a Children's Hospital team working in the Macedon area for 4 years, visiting. Halfway through that time, there was another big fire around Maryborough, and I found myself visiting two communities that were 2 years apart in the recovery, and I started to see the patterns emerging. And at that stage, nobody much knew what you should do with kids after disasters. I remember my colleague went to the hospital library and did a literature search. That's when you didn't press buttons on a machine, you actually thumbed through indexes. And I think she came up with 12 papers. That was about all that was known. And we found ourselves feeling our way, and one thing led to another, and we made representations to the department about what we should be doing, because nobody really knew. And some years later, I ended up being asked to take on a role as a consultant to the recovery plans at the time. So that's given me a sort of some kind of involvement in more or less everything that's happened since about 1989 in Victoria, and then through a similar role with Red Cross, I'm going all over the place. So I'll be off to South Australia next week to work in the fires there. And so this gives me a chance to look at lots of different communities. And what I learn is that in some ways, every disaster is the same, even whether it's a Christchurch earthquake or a cyclone in Queensland or a flood. But in another way, every disaster is completely different. Even every bushfire is completely different. The way it happens, when it happens, the kind of community, the circumstances. And so it's this very interesting mix of how do you make the connection between what is general and what's unique that gives a particular colouring for this community and this event. And the thing about children is when you're in the system talking to bureaucrats, they keep getting forgotten. They keep getting overlooked. Emergency services, present company accepted, will tend to sort of be very focused on adults. The conversation will just inevitably drift to adults. And it's very good to have someone who's because I often get dragged into that conversation too, and it's good to have a colleague there whose brief is just hang on to the kids and keep bringing them up, because they're really awkward, aren't they? They get in the way. You have to reorganise things for them and change the way you do things for them. So, I work quite a lot with adults, but all of my career, which started in 1976, I've run groups with difficult adolescents. The sort that grunt. They say, no, I want to know. Or, which means maybe, but I'm not saying. So I really enjoy that work with adolescents, and I think it's really important to understand their unique needs, but also going right back down to preschools. Melbourne University has been doing probably the first long-term recovery research that they can find in the world. There's plenty of research in the first and second years, but they've looked in the third and the fifth years at a group of people that went through Black Saturday. And a very interesting finding is that if you tabulate all of the services for all the different groups of people, there's one group for whom there are almost no services at all, and that's preschool children. The assumption being that if you talk to the parents, they're getting services. But if you're not talking to the parents about their preschool children, the preschool children are not getting a service, are they? Let alone, might we actually get them in a room together at some stage and do some work with them? So, I think there are some really important areas that we're only just starting to think about. And I'd also flag on that the experience we've had coming out of Black Saturday, where if you don't hang around for a long time, like 5, 10 years, you can't make some observations. For example, the children who were born in the year of Black Saturday, when they came up to school entry in Strathuyam Primary School, the teacher there, who's I think currently visiting some of the schools up the north, found that she couldn't just roll straight into her normal program because they weren't ready. Their development had been somehow interfered with, and she had to go back and run a preschool program to get them up to be ready to start doing what you'd normally expect to do in school. In Kinglake, they found the same thing when you had kids making their entry into secondary school who had, of course, had the fire during the middle of their primary school, when in fact kids are consolidating their core academic skills, and so when they're ready to make this leap, many of them just weren't really ready for it. And the same with the kids that were in early secondary school when they came up to year 12 3 or 4 years later. And so I think it's really important to see that it's not just looking back on the horrible experience of the disaster, but how do we actually look forward to support their development in these very unusual circumstances. And I want to talk about trauma, but it's not the only problem. In some ways, it's the easiest problem because it's not easy, but it becomes obvious because the kid shows they're frightened of smoke or they're having nightmares or something, and you've got something to work with. But when we look at their development, it's a much broader picture that we have to try and keep track of. And this is one of the themes I want to focus on. Because what I find time and again is that talking with parents, they ask questions about what should I do if, and often the things that the child is doing are the sorts of things they might do under certain circumstances normally, but because it's a disaster, the parent doesn't know whether what they would normally do is the right thing because they're in a different situation. Disasters expose how we actually have a kind of framework, a set of assumptions, a meaning system that we work within. But as long as that's stable, we don't have to think about it. We just make our decisions within it. But I think the essence of a disaster, the essence of a trauma is the framework is damaged. We don't know what to expect. We don't know what's normal. We don't know what's right. We don't know what's going to hurt people or not. And I think it's very important that one sort of really central principle is if you go back to how your child was before the event and then look at how they are now, if they're doing something different to how they were, or it may be more intense or more frequent than it was before, there's probably a connection with the disaster experience and you can start looking for it. When I was told to go up as part of the hospital team, we were told two things. You're there for 6 months. Well, they extended and extended and extended and extended for 4 years. And the other thing is, you're not there to deal with non-disaster problems. Well, every problem is also a non-disaster problem, and every non-disaster problem becomes a disaster problem because everything connects up. An anxious child is going to be more anxious after the disaster. So, you can't make those kind of arbitrary separations. So, I think that this, but hanging on to, has the disaster affected my child? You don't need to have smoke and fire being talked about necessarily. You might find that they are much more reluctant to do things they were doing before, like go away and play with a friend and be separated from mum. And then I would say, the disaster is having effect not as a trauma effect, but as a weighing down of the child so that they don't feel up to the things that they normally would do. And I want to come back to that a bit later on. But it's this, I think we need to address this loss of confidence that people often have because it's an unprecedented situation that we haven't been through before. And what I'd really say is it's so important to think back if you felt as though you knew what your child needed and what to do, and you had your style of doing it, keep going, keep doing that. If the child's very upset, talking about the fire, start off by using the normal skills and techniques that you would have used when they were very upset, when they fell over and skinned their knee, last November, because you would have all had those problems. Just continue to do your basic style of parenting. If there were problems before, and some kids do have lots of problems, and you were already unsure of what you should be doing, now I would say it's a good time to actually go and talk to somebody and get some advice, somebody who's trained, who can help you know where to go and what to do, because it's getting that confidence that you've got something that you can actually do to respond to the child, because there's no question that children immediately pick up when parents don't quite know what to do. Can you remember in your own childhood? This is really something that parents and adults should always do, is remember their own childhood. I mentioned the example of the woman came to see me recently from Ash Wednesday, who was 11 at the time, and she had to evacuate through flames with her mum and an elderly neighbour and her two younger siblings. And do you remember the first time you realised your parents were stupid, or didn't know what they were doing, or you realised that they couldn't see? This was the moment she realised her mum didn't know what she was doing, and she couldn't trust her mum to keep her alive. So if you have that moment of realisation when your life is in danger, that has a massive change. And I can see in this woman, I've been seeing her for a while, I reckon it's had a formative effect on her character, because I think she took a mothering role with her younger siblings and put her own emotional needs aside. And I think it's had a big cost on her in her own life. Why did that happen? Because it was a country family. They were dairy farmers, and they never talked about it as a family. And they lost everything except their cows and their sheds. And the parents and we moved in with grandparents, and mum and dad went on milked the cows and built the house. And imagine the responsibility of this little girl looking after everything. And she remembers vividly having to cook the dinner while the parents were in the milking shed, and mum would come in and said, it's time to put the potatoes down, and she'd go back out to the milking shed. Their battler, really kept their farm going, and so on. But there was no attention to the kids. Now, that was a bit this parents' style anyway. But the point I want to make is that she's never really processed it. She just put it aside, and she did very well at school and went off and did a qualification, got a job, and moved way away from the country in the middle of the suburbs. And still doesn't like going to the country. She'll go down for Christmas for a short time and zoom back to the suburbs. So these are the long-term consequences that we see on a person's development. But I think there can be also tremendously positive development. Children that go through disasters often have a deeper, more serious sense about life. They don't make assumptions. They have a set of values that is much more aware of what can go wrong. They've got much stronger values about helping each other and so on. So there are a lot of important things that people learn through this very important time of recovery. So it all depends, as this woman shows, on what happens to the experience from now on. How do the children integrate this? Integrate means make it part of everything else. Grow through the experience, learn from it. And that means we've got to actually help everybody to make it available for the constant reviewing and learning and talking about. Now, children have their own ways of making things make sense to them. and managing the emotions and so on. And at each age, they've got a different way of doing it. Young children will play. They'll ask repeated questions about things. Older children will, maybe not talk about it so much, but they'll be having nightmares, or they'll talk about it with their peer group, and hopefully they'll come home and say, so-and-so told me this is happening, is that right? Adolescents we need to be careful about, because adolescents have got this fine developing mind, intellect for thinking, and they'll often actually draw conclusions that are a bit bleak and pessimistic. And there's been research into this about how children, adolescents often end up more serious, but a bit sort of negative. If we're not careful, what's the point of trying to get my BCE, because we'll probably all be burned in a bushfire, and things like this. So what they've done is they've taken one element of this experience and they've brought it into the foreground. And what we want to help them do is actually put this experience into a context of recovery and growing and regeneration and learning. It's good for them to understand there were terrible fires in 1939 and 1895. I live in Yarra Glen in the Yarra Valley. There is an old 1850s National Trust farm, and I remember going in there and looking at the old newspapers from, I think it was 1895. They didn't have helicopters and satellites, but it seemed as though from Lake's entrance to Mount Gambier was on fire that year. They probably weren't even as good at mapping it, but it seemed the whole of. So we want children to understand. I would not bring it into the climate change conversation. Let's help them get to grips with bushfires first, because climate change is too big, and it's a bit scary for us adults, isn't it? Well, it is for me, but it won't be my problem. It'll be there. But anyway, let's just deal with bushfires. If we can help them understand that these fires have occurred at regular intervals, and things do come back eventually. But we've got to be patient, we've got to take time. And so what we need to be doing is helping them see. So we as adults have got to keep track of the progress. It's a very good thing to maybe take them for a walk in the burnt trees, and then come back in a couple of months when the rains come, you've got the first little shoots coming. You know what the gum trees do? They just shoot out all these little, they look like big bottle brushes. They call it epicormic growth. And what the gum trees do is they've got to get energy, so they shoot out these little branches that have little leaves on them all around, and they start getting energy and photosynthesizing again. And gradually what will happen is that some of those branches will wither and drop off, and others will sort of get the energy and start to grow more. And so gradually you'll see the tree start to reform its shape over 10, 20 years. Nature's in no hurry. It's very hard for us to wait, but nature is in no hurry, and therefore nature does it very well in the long run. And I think that's a really important message for us, because what I see happening is people engage in epicormic activity, rushing around doing everything at once, particularly if you've had the tragedy of losing your house. I remember a woman whose house was flooded once said, normally, you do one thing at a time. If you're even going to renovate your house, you do one thing at a time. But after a flood, you have to do everything at once. And you don't know what to do next. So you get locked into this busy, constant activity. It might be for yourself, it might be actually for the community, because a lot of people whose houses weren't damaged actually get very engaged in the community, and everyone's life is disrupted, isn't it? And so the risk is that you embark on a period of busyness, of epicormic activity, rushing around from one thing to another, people always in the house, always on the phone. Now, what happens to the kids? Well, there'll be a few kids that have tantrums and demand activity, but my observation is most kids, under the weighty circumstances, pull their needs back and try and help their parents out. And they try to be cooperative. They try to be good, do what they're told. That'd be a difference from before the fire, wouldn't it? And it would be a really important thing to pick up. If your child was difficult and obnoxious beforehand, and they're being very good and cooperative, you better watch out. Because what are they doing? They're putting their own needs aside, aren't they? Now that's all right for a little while, but if it goes for 2 or 3 years, that's not much for us as adults. We just get a few more wrinkles and put on a few more pounds over 3 years. But if a child goes from 13 to 16, they've passed the whole of that crucial early period of adolescence, holding back their own needs, haven't they? Being good, not being a problem, trying to help mum out. Or if they've gone from 3 to 6, these are huge epochs in development where very important experiences need to happen, because children develop not just by the unfolding of their biological tendencies, but by the engagement with the world and getting the experience that nurture and form their activities. So it's got to be this exchange between being ready for something and having the opportunity to express it, and then learn from it and consolidate the skill and then try something new and so on. And it's this, and when do they learn the most? Not when, sorry about this teachers, not when they're in the classroom, but when they're outside talking to each other. You know, they'll get an input, but it's like a cow, takes the grass and then it chews its cud, and the children chew their cud with each other. That's when the assimilation going. Now if they don't feel free to play, that, you know, and we'll see some kids who don't want to go out and play, they want to stay home with mum because they heard her crying in the bedroom last night, or and so they want to keep an eye on, they want to, you know, be around. And so, you know, I think there's a really important issue about holding on to the frame of life so that the children can get on with what they need to do. And what they need to do is to play and have fun and explore and do the washing up, make their beds and whatever else, you know, they're appropriate chores. But it's this enjoyment and creativity and mixing, because actually it's hard to make friendships and get on with them and not pick fights. This is hard work for kids, isn't it? So this is where their core skills are being developed. So so we've got this project of going forward, and I'm really sorry to say this, but the recovery takes a few years. And that's why it's really important that the community sort of starts at a pace which you can maintain for the period of time it takes. I, you know, can say, I don't know what things will be like here, but I know in Yarra Ranges, after Black Saturday, after 2 years, only 40% of the people who lost their house had building permits. A small number of them had rebuilt after 2 years. Like, I don't know, about a quarter of them had rebuilt. But the rest had got as far as getting their building permits. So they put all their plans in and got them approved. But the other 60% hadn't been able to get themselves together to do that. Why not? Maybe they were looking after their kids and they didn't have as much time. Because I reckon the real effect of disaster is not what happens on the day, even if it burns your house down. Mercifully, we don't have to talk about deaths, which complicates it, but it's what happens over the next 18 months to 2 years. That will determine whether this becomes an experience that everyone learns from and grows from and develops, because you keep the focus on what's important, or whether in fact that gets pushed aside and you rush around doing things and you come out the other end. And you know, I know that people who said they kind of lost connection with their kids, In fact, I can tell you a story. 7 years after Ash Wednesday, I was just starting to get this sense, and sorry, present company accepted. I was doing a training session for triple SOs or whatever they were called back in 1980, whatever. Mm-hmm. And just on this, what I've been learning, and I noticed sitting up the back was a woman who's absolutely riveted on everything I was saying. And in the break, she came up and she said, and this is 7 years after Ash Wednesday, she said, "This is the first time I've understood what's happened to my family." Now, she's a psychologist. You'll probably say, well, that probably is going to explain everything. Her husband was a primary school principal. So they're, well-educated people who know about kids. They lose their house. The next door house is intact. That's pretty common, isn't it? The next door house is inhabited by an older couple whose kids have grown up and left home. Now they've got, she said she had a 14-year-old daughter and a 7-year-old son. So the neighbours say, "Well, move in with us. We've got all the facilities." Now, how would you feel living with your neighbour on the left for 2 years? They might be quite nice people, but you just, and what do you not do when you're in somebody else's house? Lots of things. Well, you don't fight with your husband, do you? You don't yell at the kids. You ask them nicely if they wouldn't mind. All of the communication becomes formalised, and you don't have that intimate, private language that you have in families, where defines the family. I've learned that intimacy is incredibly important to protect in the post-disaster environment, because it gets eroded, because the boundaries are eroded. Everyone's, I have as little to do as I can with Facebook, but I understand there's a lot of turmoil on Facebook, and I think that's often about eroded boundaries. People know more than they should about other people's circumstances. After the disasters, as though, just like you can see through the bush, suddenly it's all open. You can look from one end of the town to the other, and you can see through people's lives. We shouldn't have that much privacy, that much openness. We should have more privacy. But one thing we can do about that is just simply not pass on gossip. Just don't pass. Just let it sit with you. Just hold it there, because it's not going to do any good. Although we want to, don't we? Because it's emotionally charged. We want to tell somebody something we can. Just let it sit with you, and that helps the whole community settle. So, intimacy. We lose intimacy. Without privacy, we lose intimacy. So they move in. She said after a few weeks she wasn't feeling that comfortable in somebody else's house, and she said to the neighbour, "Look, thanks very much, you've been just too kind. We don't want to inconvenience you anymore." She's a psychologist, she's very polite. "We don't want to inconvenience you anymore, but look, I think we'll get a caravan on our block like everyone else." Back in 1983. "Don't be ridiculous," she says. "I won't hear of it. No, you've got all the facilities. We're not going to be using it. No, I insist you stay." And she said several more times over the next few months, she tried to suggest they move out, and she was overridden. Why is this psychologist and school principal allowing their judgment, their needs to be overridden? Eventually, she and her husband, she said, "I was going crazy. I said to my husband, order the caravan to be delivered on Saturday morning. We'll tell them at breakfast." And at breakfast, they say, "Look, thanks very much. You've been too kind. We can't impose on you anymore," etc., etc., etc. "We've got the caravan coming." And she says, "No, I won't hear of it. It's absolutely stupid. You've got all the facilities here. Where are you getting the caravan from?" "Ring them up, Harry, and cancel it," she says to her husband. And he rings it up and cancels it. Harry rings it up and cancels it. And they stay there till their house is built. Psychologists, you see, they haven't got any idea what's going on. And she says, "Now, my husband and I are still together, but we're just good friends." See, she's lost her marriage. Maybe it's not irreversible, but she doesn't know what happened. She said, my 14-year-old, she's okay. She's now 21 at university, but she lives in and we hardly ever see her. The 14-year-old, I reckon, went into her peer group because that's where she got the intimacy and the privacy of people who were able to listen to her and tune into her. And so she's replaced crucial family functions with a peer group, and they're not the same. And I'll speak a bit later about adolescents and their peer group after disaster. She said, the one I feel really sorry for is my 7-year-old at the time. He was a happy, outgoing kid, loved learning at school, had lots of friends, very busy. Now he's a lonely, isolated 14-year-old who spends his whole day in his room in the lounge room watching television. He has no friends and he's failing at school. You know, you can see that this child's whole development has gone right off track, and she hasn't been able to work out what's going on because it's happening slowly and steadily, and she's totally preoccupied by all of the problems of building a new house and dealing with life and dealing with her grief and so on and so forth. You know, it's like the family has just, it hasn't disintegrated, but it's lost its heart, hasn't it? And, you know, when I hear these stories, and I could give numerous stories like this of people who've sort of told me sadly a long time later about things, and I think, do you mind if I tell other people this story? You know, I think it really just says something about what the real issue here is. It's not about what's just happened. It's about how do I protect what's important going into the future. What is important? Well, one of the things I like to say is think back to how things were before the fire and ask yourself, what did I do in a routine way that expressed the values and meaning and joy of my life? Routinely, right? Just as a regular, that really kept life feeling worthwhile. And then the question is, are you still doing it? And if not, what are you doing instead? And if you're in epicormic activity, there's something that's not being replenished, isn't it? It's going to slowly run out. And, you know, parents and children will continue to interact, but they'll do it in a more superficial and empty way. And so I think one of the most important things we need to start with when we're setting out on this recovery journey is open the conversation about the disaster with our kids and each other, because it's a huge experience that we can't possibly grasp, you know, in a short time, because its meaning and its consequences will slowly unfold over years. So we need to keep revisiting it. I used to work in the inpatient unit, psych inpatient unit at the Children's Hospital, before there was a state child protection system. All the child protection used to be done by the Children's Protection Society, and many of the very traumatised kids would end up in our unit before they went to whatever accommodation they were going to have. And, you know, I saw many of those kids and worked with some of them. And I came to the conclusion you can't really work traumas through with children because it means something different at each new age, doesn't it? Because as the child grows, their understanding, their emotions are all different, and they have to kind of reprocess it. So that what we can do is, if we can make the child not feel frightened to think about it and talk about it, then as they move into a new stage and they suddenly think back and realise something, they can talk about it with their friends, their family, or draw pictures, or you know, actually work with it because they're not frightened of it. What is not helpful is to shut it down.
Rob, how important is checking facts with children through an event? So, you know, talking to children about, and obviously, and I guess who is the best, obviously parents are the best people to do that, you know, having a discussion around the dinner table about, you know, about the event and what happened. I just remember as a child, my auntie's house was broken into, and I was pretty sure that it had, like, the house had actually split in half. And that, you know,
What age were you?
I would have been about 4 or 5, and the police were checking people's speed and they were using lines on the road, and I thought they were 2 lions chasing after cars, and I thought that for probably 6 years. Probably till I was about 12, I thought the police were like running around with lines chasing cars.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering like how important is it?
So this is the pictorial thinking of young children. They will form pictures of words instead of concepts. I think it's absolutely crucial. But I think we also need to do it with adolescents because they'll do it in a more conceptual way, but also the meaning mightn't be right. So when I say open the conversation, the first thing you can do is check their understanding of it, and using the appropriate language, because you know how to communicate with them, you know how to get them to brush their teeth, and you will have told them why they should do it. Well, in the same way, you might use the same sort of language and style to talk about why there are bushfires and what happened on the day, and sort out some of those myths and confusions. And while we're talking about that, we can come to the constant ruminating questions that children ask. Now, what you've got to think about is children's capacity to experience things is much deeper and more complicated than their ability to express in words what they're going through. Do you remember in your own life having complicated feelings as a young child that you had no idea how to communicate? I like to tell the story of lying in bed in the summertime in Adelaide, and there must have been a cicada or something would make this funny whistling, chirping noise and go past the window, and it absolutely terrified me. But then I'd fall asleep. I never thought in the morning to say, what's that funny noise? It terrifies me. It just never occurred to me that I should communicate. It was just my own little harrowing ritual before going to sleep. You know? Do you remember not telling your parents about things that weighed on you? You know, none of us had, or was it just me? None of us had parents that we could talk freely to. But in fact, we can actually open the conversation with them. So when they ask a question, you give the answer. Then they ask the same question again. You know you haven't answered their question because they probably don't know how to ask it. Sometimes you can deal with that by saying, so what have you been thinking about that makes you ask about this? Maybe you might know, are you asking about this because we went to Auntie Jones and saw something or another on the way? But try to, not just give an answer, but engage in a conversation with it before you give them the answer. And in that conversation, you might hopefully get out from them that they've got some misunderstanding about it. And here's something I've learned. A high status peer outranks a parent in knowing what's going on in the world. Right? What do parents know? At the age of 4 already. I could give you a case study of a 4-year-old who was absolutely told something by the high status peer who was a bit of a bully and wanted to make this child feel frightened. They told him something about the situation that made this child terrified, and she cried at home, and Mum said, no, it's not happening. Yes, it is, because Mary told me. So actually, I told the mother to discredit Mary and explain why Mum knew what was the pathway, that Mum had the facts and Mary didn't have the facts. So that's one thing that we really have to do, I think, because if we open this conversation, that doesn't mean we talk about it all the time, but I think over the next while, and they're settling back in school, and I've suggested the teachers, they just open the conversation, and the teachers didn't do much. The kids were just talking about it and drawing pictures and whatever. Just let them know it's okay to talk about this. Now, this is where it's important for parents to have confidence that talking about it is good. Dredging up emotions that aren't already on the surface is not good. Leave that to the experts, where there's a reason why this child's carrying something that they can't talk about, so we'll try and get it out and work on that. But you don't need to worry about that. So you just offer opportunities, invite them in whatever way they feel comfortable to communicate with you. And then you'll have some understanding of what you're working with. And they'll have the feeling it's okay to talk about it. Now here's something really important. Often when any of us starts to talk about something that's very deep, we suddenly find unexpectedly tears come, don't we? It happens to all of us. It used to happen to Bob Hawke, didn't it? Talking about something, and John Howard at the Port Arthur and various other tragedies, tears would come. It's actually very appropriate, isn't it? But what do? What do we do? Apologise. We've got social values that said you shouldn't impose your sadness on other people by having tears. Actually, it shows that you're opening a door and allowing a rush. Now, we know that that rush of emotion will have all sorts of biological and chemical processes that ease tensions and allow things to be released, and it's part of the processing. So I think what's important is to hold in your mind that expressed emotion is not the problem. It's unexpressed emotion. It's emotions that's locked down, because once we don't express the emotion, we've got no way of finding out, what's bothering us. So, and I would say this: you don't have to do anything about the emotion different from what you would have done when they grazed their knees in the playground. You just comfort them. And, if they're saying, what's the meaning of life? Don't worry about that just now. Just comfort them and tell them that you love them, they're very important. Just sit with them and you'll find it settle down. And wait till they're calm, and then you can say, you said life wasn't worth living when I'm just giving an example, maybe of an adolescent. Life wasn't worth living when you were sad the other day. You've been thinking about it, try and have a conversation. And here's a really important thing that I think holds for all ages. It's like we've got two systems in our brain. One system to process high threat information, and another system to process low threat information. And you'll hear this when people tell stories. And they'll tell the story of how something happened, and you get to a point where there's a moment of danger, and they don't continue with their story. They'll say, I don't know, I saw the fire coming and I thought we were not going to get out. Like the woman I spoke about. We were evacuating and the flames were blowing across the car, and we were evacuating. I could see my mum was panicking, and I knew she wasn't in control. It was the first time. And they'll go off then spontaneously into sort of talking about the emotions, or maybe they'll just start crying. Now, what we have to hang on to, whether it's a 4-year-old or a 14-year-old or a 44-year-old, we've got to hang on to the curiosity of, they didn't think they were going to make it, but here they are standing in front of us. I wonder how they did make it. That's what we've got to hang on to. Be curious about what they're not telling us. Don't get sucked into where they're going, which is into their emotions. And when they calm down and settle down, say, tell me, how did you get out? Why didn't you die? What did you do to keep yourself safe? Somebody was talking earlier today about a parent being out of control and the child didn't feel safe. And so if you leave the conversation at that point, this child is sitting in an experience of, I can't trust my parents because they no longer keep them safe, right? The question you need to ask is, did your parents resume control? And did you feel safe again? When was that? Because that puts a boundary around that experience. And post-traumatic stress consists of fragments of experience, of these high threat experiences that just go around in a loop and don't go anywhere, because you go off to the memories, to the moment of high arousal, and then you go off into emotions and probably what might have happened, and you can't even deal with what might have happened because it didn't happen. And what we want instead is that they develop a loop where the memory goes up into this peak of arousal and then continues on with the memories about how it all comes to a conclusion. But to do that, we've got to keep them talking along that pathway. We now know it's to do with brain circuits. And if you don't ask the right question, they don't go down that circuit, they go down that circuit, so to speak. You've got to change the points. And I think we can do that simply by just ensuring that when you're talking with your child, you complete the story. Trauma consists of fragments of incredibly vivid, threatening experience, fragments that are not joined together very well, and we don't realise if we're traumatised, we don't realise they're not joined together. It's just leaping from one fragment to another. And so converting the fragments into a story, a narrative, a history, allows us to put it in the past. That's what history is. It's a story in the past. What trauma is, it's not in the past, it keeps exploding into the present, and I feel frightened now. And that's the stronger the experience of the child, the more we've got to allow time for that to be slowly massaged into the past through the conversations. Or it could be any way the child has of expressing it. Some children talk easily, some don't, but maybe drawing pictures or playing it out with their dolls or whatever it might be. And with teenage boys, I don't know what it's like in Mallacoota, but my son, when he was a teenager, grunted and didn't say much. So as long as you get a sentence out, that'll get it going, just a sentence or two. And here's my advice from many years of trying to talk to adolescents. Cut when you're ahead. Don't keep talking until they say, look, can we just stop talking about this, Mum? Dad, whatever. I'm sick of this. You always go on about this. My wife was a social worker. Our kids would, when she tried to get the conversation going, are you trying to social work us? It's cut while you're ahead. You just need to seed the process. Just need to, move it along a little bit. So as long as you get a couple of sentences, let it go. What's incomplete for us is enough for them for the moment. Don't put your adult, I just want to sort this out so I'll feel much better about my child, they've all been fixed up. It's not the way to go. Just watch them. And when they start, I used to have a really difficult girl that would come to see me. She had lots and lots of problems. And, we booked them in for 50 minutes or something. I'd start talking to her. And as soon as we would get on to the real problems in her life, which was usually about 10 minutes into the conversation, she'd start looking at the clock. And I'd realise whatever we'd done up to then, that's all we're going to do. So I'd just have a nice chat with her for a while and let her go early. And she thought she was an early minute. I'm a psychologist. And it was enough. She's been able to keep coming. So we want, most of all, that the conversation is felt to be rewarding and they'll do it again. That's the important thing. And so I think this process of seeing that it's only over time that we deal with this experience, and we deal with it slowly and steadily. And therefore, we want to be able to see that over the next few years, as these children grow, they can assimilate this experience into their growing capacities. I think there are three main problems. We've talked about trauma. Now, there are a lot of details you can get about trauma, and if your child shows signs of nightmares or fearfulness or startling at loud noises, they don't have to be smoke and flames. It could be any vigorous or unexpected thing because basically the trauma has made them feel unsafe. Or that also often alternates with just shutting it down, just becoming detached and not seeming to care. So I think if your kids are showing that, we don't diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder until a month after the event, because it's not a disorder. Everybody feels those things. Everybody has those things. So just keep doing your thing. Keep trying to talk about it with them. Keep trying to make them feel safe, get the routines going, and really importantly, try and help them have pleasurable experiences. enjoyment. And then, if it keeps going, don't wait too long before you get advice. You don't necessarily have to take your child along. Maybe the best thing might be you see somebody and see, if there are some things you could do. And then later on, maybe they might need some work with somebody. And we find that many kids only need a few sessions if we get to them early. So just keep a track on those trauma symptoms. So the three problems are trauma, loss, and disruption. Loss could be the loss of houses, it could be the loss of friends, it could be the loss of an environment. The houses all around me burned down. It's a big loss. Could be the loss of the bush. Children have a tremendous sense of place and nature. They don't always know how to express it. Encourage them to speak about their life. Now, the response to loss is grief. And grief is the way of getting over loss. And grief means being sad and weeping and talking and whatever else, remembering and rituals and things like that. And it takes time, doesn't it? Because if something's important to us, we've created a space for it in our inner world. And when it's no longer there, it's like there's a hole. There's something that should be outside, that's reflected inside. It's not outside, so I don't know what to do. Gradually, by talking about it, we can rebuild it inside. Like when we lose a loved one, we have to actually let go of the deep habitual expectation that this person is really outside and rebuild around the memories and get, come to grips with the fact that I must carry now this person inside. It's very hard to accept the reality of loss. But when we do accept it, then we can move on. And I think this is, all sorts of people are going to have all sorts of different losses, and that's something that we need to create a nurturing, compassionate environment, because nobody will know exactly what the loss means to somebody else. But there'll be people grieving in all sorts of ways. The third one is the disruption. And the disruption is this loss of routines, this loss of the structures in our lives that preserve our values and end up with the kind of tragedy that was in that case that I mentioned. And the way we avoid that is to really hold attention to the routines and building those structures in our lives that preserve the values. And if there were one thing I would say to parents as you embark on the recovery, please make a structure in your life where you can give your children your full attention, hopefully every day, or as often as you possibly can. That means turn your phone off, just be with them. Don't try and do anything, just be with them and see what happens. See what happens when out of this sense that they know that you are there for them and you see them. These are things that kids can't really articulate. And it's amazing. I learned that in my work. Often I see people that are really difficult. I don't know what to do with them. Everyone thinks we've got the answers, but I don't know what to do sometimes. So, when I have someone coming in and I don't know what to do, I think, I won't try and do anything. I'll just be with them and see what happens. And, something magical happens then that I wouldn't have ever expected. Just be with them where they are. When the child is sad, it's very hard for us as adults, isn't it? We want them to be happy. It hurts us for them to be sad. So we try to cheer them up. Yeah, if it's a small thing, they scrape their knee or whatever, we can cheer them up. But if it's deep, I think what helps is to sit with them in it. And you'll find that actually when they let tears go, there's a natural process of loosening up and change. You know it yourself if you have a good cry or whatever, you actually see things a little differently. We've got to have the confidence that if we allow the child to be in that experience, they will come out of it. They won't cry that long. 10 minutes, a long time for us as parents to sit with them. Half an hour, have to be really sad to cry for half an hour, really disturbed to cry for an hour. But eventually they will stop. And I liken it to this, that if somebody's really sad and you listen for a little while and then you think, I better try and cheer them up. So you actually say, you know, look on the bright side, or, you know, all those sort of things that we might say. That's a bit like, you know, going over and standing next to somebody who's really miserable and saying, yeah, I can see you're really unhappy and sad and you've got a lot of problems. Why don't you come over here with me? But they can't because their foot is tied to the floor. They can't get away from their problem. So I've actually gone somewhere that's more comfortable for me, but they can't move. They're all alone, aren't they? Remember, if the child's not communicating, they're all alone, like I was about the cicadas. So just open that door and see what happens. I think it's so important. And have confidence that you don't have to get it right. You don't have to get it right. You just have to be trying hard. And the children will forgive us. That's what I've learned. And it's that intention. I want to say a couple of things before we finish about some of the research findings about children and disasters. In the United States, they have people that do a lot of big research projects. The first thing is, when they look at all the studies, age is not a vulnerability factor. In other words, just because a child's younger doesn't mean they're more likely to have problems. There are healthy, robust 7-year-olds that will do much better than unhappy, conflicted, troubled 80-year-olds. You know, so we need to actually, people will often say their older child is actually unhappier than their younger child. So just because they're young. So we've got to pitch the way we talk to them to their appropriate level. The second one is that, sorry to say this, but one of the best predictors of the children who are going to have problems are the parental attitudes, the attitudes of their parents. If the parents are anxious and troubled and unhappy and feel overwhelmed and can't see the wood for the trees and don't know how the future's going to turn out, naturally the kids won't see that either. So really prioritise your own mental health, your own emotional well-being, which means if you look after yourself and keep yourself positive, which means taking time out to rest and enjoy yourself and prioritising your social life and all those things, that'll be one of the best things you can give to your child, is your own positive disposition. You can't work hard and then say, oh, Rob Gordon said I should give my full attention. Okay. It's not going to be good enough. You have to take care of yourself. And the other thing that comes out in the research is negative emotional tone in the family. Squabbling, bickering, being angry, arguing, maybe stony silence. So one thing you can just do is make a decision in the family to preserve your manners. You know, makes me sound like a school principal.
Very much.
Like I used to have. But, you know, just actually, you know, not yell at each other, just try to make that decision to model, you know, politeness and care and mutual respect and all those simple things. These are the core of mental. It's no good sending the kid to a counsellor when everyone's bickering and angry and unhappy at home. And it's very clear that if parents are full of worry and anger and anxiety, if you don't, you know, let it fly too much around the family and hold it in, and when the children have gone to sleep, you then process that. You protect the children. You know, just like we wash our hands, don't we? We protect. So we just try to preserve that boundary about what's an adult concern. If you do find yourself weeping in the bedroom, have a talk to the child when you're feeling better. Sorry, I was upset. It's okay. I was worried about the insurance. but we're going to go and meet and we will sort it out, you know. The other thing I wanted to say was there is a lot of talk now about resilience. You've heard that word, no doubt? Actually, I noticed that disaster victims have allergic reaction to talk about resilience because everyone tells them they should be resilient. And it's a very important idea because it does embody the idea that people can rebound and get back and move on. We could have a different conversation in a year's time about the later stages of recovery. This whole conversation we could have about that. But you know, one day I was trying to get my head around this resilience and I looked it up in the dictionary and then I went to the Latin dictionary. And when you look it up, there's got two parts, re and xyle. Resile. You know, politicians say, I will not resile from whatever, means I won't go back from what I've said I do. But if you look up this word xyle, you come to the Latin word for reeds. You know, reeds in the riverbed. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, that must be the essence of resilience, isn't it? Because reeds are flattened by the flood, and then they come back again. But the oak trees are flattened and get washed out to sea. They don't come back. So that, to me, the essence of resilience is those structures in us, social structures, mental structures, emotional structures, which have a capacity to flex and deform under pressure, but not break, and then come back again. And so that when the pressure's off, they will come back. And I think that's what we can expect to find with children. Children will go back to an earlier stage of their development because they can't cope with being at the age they're at, because that involves excitement and initiative and energy, and they can't do it because they've got all these big problems. So they'll go back to when they felt comfortable. We call it regression. Adolescents will go back, to not accepting the responsibility. 7-year-olds will go back to being a 4-year-old, or they'll cling. It'll be in different patterns. So have a look. Are they behaving in any, it might be annoying, they're being annoying. Have a look. Is that feature something that you would have expected them to have done a year or 2 or 3 earlier? Then they've gone back to where their development was secure and comfortable, and now they've freed up excess mental energy, haven't they? Because they've done that. They know how to be like that. And now they can start processing their unhappiness and their trauma. And so one of the research findings is regression is an incredibly important and valuable part of recovery. And one of the things that predicts children not recovering is the prohibiting of regression. Teachers saying, just because your house is burnt down doesn't mean you don't do your homework because you've got year 12 coming on. If you don't get through this, you'll never, Now, a lot of children say, oh, well, okay, I'll do my best. And then they collapse halfway through the first year at uni and can't do it, if that's what they were going to do. And it could be at home, parents saying, just because we've lost our house doesn't mean you don't do the washing up, make your bed and brush your teeth. Try to just be prepared to sort of play it flexibly and let them go back and indulge them for a while. Because what I've found time and again in lots of different situations, that if you let the kids regress and support them to do that, they will start using that to process it. And pretty soon, a few months maybe, they will actually suddenly leap ahead to where they should have been. You suddenly see this change because they're ready to get back to where they were. And this is where the crucial thing is, did they have a problem in this area beforehand? If not, this is constructive regression. If they had a problem, maybe they really need some support for that problem because, they're having trouble dealing with it. But most of the kids, I think you'll find, will make this leap. Probably they will spend a good half a year or so not functioning quite up to their ideal pitch, and then if you've supported them and let them do it, I think you'll find they'll catch up towards the end of the year. And my experience is, if they can't do it, they can't do it. And putting pressure on them to do it just makes it worse. It doesn't mean, of course, you let go your basic boundaries and values and so on. You've got to hang on to all that. But the final thing I'd like to say is that the resources for resilience, attachment, the attachment they have to us, that's where they get their energy. They're like batteries, they've got to be plugged in. The continuing achievement and the recognition that they're part of a normal community. This is the value of a communal disaster. It's so different from seeing a child that's had a solitary event and they feel completely different to everyone else. The fact that they can be in a school here together will be an enormous help with them. Giving them the time and the support to process this, to talk about it, to reflect on, to think about when they want to, and helping them manage emotions in all sorts of ways. Just sitting with them, if they just feel overwhelmed, maybe they can take a day off school because they're probably not going to learn anything anyway, are they? If they're doing it every second day, that's another matter. But just a day off, or just ease up a little bit, and then help them get back. Teach them and pick up some of the information that will be around about how you might help kids develop an ability to manage themselves. And I think what you'll find is that they'll come out of this very interesting people as they grow up from this experience that becomes part of their lives. I'll finish with this one little anecdote. A woman I know came to talk to me after Black Saturday because she had been making films for the CFA, and she made a film of survivors of the 1939 bushfires. Now these were, they were often elderly women in their 80s and 90s, and she said, I talked to an 85-year-old woman, and a lot of people died in that event, and as she talked, she wept. And when she pulled herself together, she said, this is the first time I've ever spoken about this experience. You know, she's carried it her entire life. And we then had a conversation about what she knew about this woman, and bearing in mind what I said about the other woman, I felt as though, you know, you could kind of suspect there were certain features in her character that were a consequence of this aloneness, that this huge experience she'd never communicated to anyone about it. And so it's not hard to get out of that. We just need to let it be part of our everyday life, and the kids will actually then grow with it. Look, I'll finish there and see if there's any questions or any thoughts people have.
I'm sure Dr.